Luke started. I've decided to let my parents move into our house. His tone matter-of-fact. And with your lack of cooking skills, it's become quite inconvenient, he added. Then, as if it was the most reasonable thing in the world, he told me to leave. I was stunned. He approached me with a smile, clearly pleased with himself as though he'd done something extraordinary. I stood there, speechless for a moment, unable to believe what I was hearing. Finally, I found my voice. I would never let my parents live here, but you've gone ahead and invited yours in without even asking me. I could barely control my anger as I added, and now you want to throw me out, the rightful owner of this house? Luke's overbearing attitude had been grating on me for years, but at that moment, it turned my stomach. I couldn't keep living like this. His sense of entitlement, as if the house were his alone despite not contributing a cent, had worn me thin. I'm Addison, a woman in my 40s, working hard to provide for our family. Luke, my husband, stays home, doing the housework. While I appreciate his role, his increasingly bossy behavior had become unbearable. His constant demands, like asking me to get ice cream in the middle of the night, were starting to get to me. When I refused, he'd threaten me, reminding me of his so-called authority as my husband. It made my blood boil. His need to assert dominance, based purely on gender, filled me with frustration. Balancing his demands with my stressful job had become more than I could bear. I'm really tired, I finally whispered, my voice breaking. I can't keep doing this. I've reached my limit, I added, retreating to my room, desperate for a break from the tension. But Luke wasn't about to let it go. He followed me, demanding to know what was going on. Why are you acting like this, Addison? You can't just walk away, he said, his voice thick with anger, as if I owed him an explanation. Exhausted, I forced a smile and tried to explain. I'm just so tired, Luke. Please understand, I pleaded. He only looked disappointed. My apologies seemed to do little to calm him, and I could feel myself sinking further under the weight of his constant need to control. Days passed, and I endured Luke's unrelenting demands, but one day, my body finally gave in. I woke up with a fever, the result of stress and exhaustion. I had to take a day off work, too weak to even care for myself. When I told Luke, he shrugged it off. You're just making excuses, he said, dismissing my illness without a second thought. You can still do your chores, he added coldly. Alone in my room, feverish and miserable, I longed for just the smallest gesture of kindness, maybe a cold compress or a gentle word, but none came. I lay there, drowning in pain and loneliness, questioning why I was the one suffering alone. Why was I the only one putting up with this? What had I done to deserve this? The agony of my situation weighed heavily on me, leaving me wondering if this was what my life had come to. I cried quietly in the dark, asking myself why things couldn't just get better. After 3 long days, my fever broke, and I had to go back to work. My colleagues, noticing my exhaustion, expressed concern. Are you okay, Addison? You look wiped out, one of them said, their genuine kindness in sharp contrast to Luke's indifference. Their concern almost brought me to tears. I was reaching my breaking point. A voice inside me screamed that I couldn't keep living like this, but even in my overwhelmed state, I lacked the strength to confront Luke or imagine a life without him. The thought of facing that reality was too much to bear. Each day, I kept going, pushing through the exhaustion, only to return home to more of Luke's demands. The cycle felt endless, draining me in every way. Then one day, Luke came to me with an unusual excitement. It had been so long since we'd had a serious conversation that his eagerness caught my attention. Addison, we need to talk, he said, his tone almost too enthusiastic. As I sat down, wondering what he was about to say, Luke, with a strange fervor, began. I had never imagined this moment would come, but there it was. Luke dropped a bombshell. I'm letting my parents move into our house, he said, his tone casual, and by the way, your inability to cook is becoming a problem. His words cut deeper than I expected. What hit me even harder, though, was his audacious plan to force me out. I want to change the house's ownership to include my parents, divorce you, and start a new family, he declared bluntly. These are final decisions, Addison. Your objections won't change anything, he added, his voice hard and cold. I was stunned, unable to process the weight of his words. A wave of dizziness hit me, my world spinning as I tried to absorb what was happening. Why can't we just live together with your parents? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, trembling with disbelief. They want to be closer to me, Luke replied, completely unfazed, as if I was overreacting. He continued, with a confidence I couldn't understand, Addison, as the man of the house, I make the decisions. That was it. I knew then, in that moment, that I couldn't stay with him any longer. The unbearable weight of his arrogance and lack of respect crushed me. Luke chuckled dismissively. You're blinded by love, aren't you? I'm just trying to take care of my family, he said flippantly, as though he were doing me a favor. But in truth, I hadn't loved him in a long time. I've fallen out of love with you, I said quietly, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside. What I feel now is astonishment at your selfishness and regret that I didn't leave sooner. Luke seemed to misunderstand, his expression softening as if he thought my hesitation to divorce was a sign of lingering affection. If you leave, you'll be all alone. Are you sure about this? His voice wavered, and I could see him trying to regain control. I didn't flinch. I'll leave, I said firmly. Luke looked taken aback, clearly unprepared for my resolute response, his face twisted with disbelief. You won't manage without me, he muttered, as if my independence was something he couldn't fathom. I've already fallen out of love with you, I repeated, my words now clearer, more final. Letting go of what's toxic is liberating. Those words seemed to hit him harder than I expected. He stood frozen, lost for words. I nodded to him, thanked him for everything, and walked away, leaving the house that had once been mine. When I arrived at my parents' home, I explained everything to them. They were furious at Luke, but their anger slowly turned to concern once they saw I had a plan. With their support, I began to heal. The first step, the divorce. After sending the papers, Luke messaged me, expressing confusion and uncertainty about what was happening. I clarified my feelings, and then he fell silent. Days later, I received the finalized divorce papers from him. I completed my part and filed them with the county office. Luke and I were now strangers. No longer did I have the weight of supporting him and his whims. The division of assets was straightforward. Luke kept the house, something I'd never wanted to begin with. I gladly walked away from it. Instead, I opted for alimony. Since Luke wasn't employed, his parents picked up the tab, but I knew he'd be job hunting soon, likely planning to pay them back once he found something stable. But life has a way of throwing curveballs, and a month after the divorce, I was settling into my new home, enjoying the peace and space I'd craved. Then, one day, I received a call from Luke. Annoyance simmered beneath the surface, but I knew ignoring him wouldn't help. I steeled myself and answered. Hello, Luke, what do you want after all this time? My voice betrayed just a hint of the exhaustion I felt. His voice cracked with desperation. Please help me, he pleaded, but I couldn't bring myself to feel sympathy. I raised an eyebrow, sensing he was in trouble. What happened? You need to tell me if you want my help, I said, even though I already had a pretty good idea of where this was going. Reluctantly, Luke began to explain, stammering through his words. I became the full owner of the house. It worked for a month, but now I can't afford the rent. I thought my parents could cover it since they live on a pension, but the bill's $1,800, and they can't pay it. They're furious, and now they're threatening me. I didn't know who else to turn to, so I'm calling you, he finished, clearly at a loss. My frustration was palpable, but a part of me felt a grim satisfaction as I listened to him unravel. He blamed me, claiming I hadn't warned him about the terms of the lease. I acknowledged that I might have made a mistake, but his ignorance about the rent, something that directly affected him, was entirely his fault. You pushed me aside and treated me like an outsider, and now you're facing the consequences, I said firmly. He seemed unbothered by my lack of sympathy, continuing his pleading. I need your help, Addison. We can't keep going like this, he insisted, his desperation growing. I could tell by his voice that the rent was overdue, and the landowner was probably already making threats. I'd lived under the same roof, and I knew how unforgiving that landlord could be. I don't have anyone else to turn to, Luke added. You still care about me, right? I wanted to tell him that I no longer cared, that my feelings for him had long since evaporated, but instead, I kept my calm. I replied coldly, I'm sorry, but do I have any obligation to help you? You were the one who left me. Isn't it a bit too convenient that you're asking me for help now? Luke's voice wavered with desperation as he tried to defend himself. Please, don't be so cold. I can't do this without you. Whether you still love me or not doesn't matter. We were married, Addison. Can't you help me out, just this once? No, I responded firmly, my patience running thin. It's been a long time since I stopped loving you. You left me, and even before that, my feelings for you had already faded. My words came out sharp, carrying all the frustration and despair I had bottled up for so long. The silence on the other end of the phone was deafening, and I could almost hear Luke's disbelief. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for him, but the weight of my emotions held firm. For years, I had endured his selfishness, his disregard for me, his mistreatment, even his indifference when I was sick, all in the hope of salvaging our marriage. I had given so much of myself, trying to make things work, but now, this was the result. The question that tormented me was, why hadn't I left sooner? Why hadn't I distanced myself from Luke when my love for him had already faded? Regret washed over me, mingled with the anger that I still felt toward him. Throughout our relationship, Luke never truly saw me, he never showed concern or effort, he never once walked beside me as an equal. Instead, he treated me like a servant, a provider, and in the end, an obstacle to his own selfish desires. Yet now, with everything falling apart, he had the audacity to beg for my help, as if I were the one who had wronged him. His self-centered attitude made me sick. Please help me, Addison, I'm begging you, how about we get married again? This time, I'll do things right, I promise, I'll never kick you out again, he pleaded, his desperation palpable. I let out a bitter laugh. Remarry you? Are you kidding me? All of this, every bit of it, is because of your actions. I tried for so long to connect with you, to get you to see me. But now you want me to pretend none of that ever happened? You want me to go back to that hellish life? That will never happen. I'm not going back to that, no matter what, I exclaimed, the raw emotion pouring out of me. Tears welled up in my eyes, a mix of anger and sadness that I could no longer contain. Luke was silent, and for a moment, I almost thought he understood, but I knew better. I'm done, I said, my voice breaking. Goodbye, and without waiting for a response, I hung up. That was the last time I heard from him. I blocked his number, not wanting to hear another word. A few days later, I heard through mutual friends that Luke and his family had been evicted. Apparently, he had tried to convince my former in-laws to pay his rent, but they refused, furious with him for not keeping his promises. Luke had still not found a full-time job and was scraping by with part-time work. Meanwhile, my former in-laws had sold their house and were now living in a cramped, run-down apartment. As for me, I threw myself into my work. My boss even spoke to me about a potential promotion. There was a chance I could become the first female manager at the company. My colleagues and juniors admired my hard work, and I felt a sense of purpose I hadn't had in years. Sometimes, friends would ask, "Are you going to get married again?" Honestly, after everything I had been through, the thought of marriage seemed like something I couldn't bear. The idea of dating or entering another relationship wasn't appealing, but life was long, and there was no rush. At my age, many people lived the rest of their lives unmarried, and I had come to understand that as long as I could live my life without regrets, that was enough. If I could live true to myself, that was all that mattered. And so, with that in mind, I chose to walk forward at my own pace, unburdened by the past, and free to live life on my own terms.